Good afternoon and welcome to today's Georgetown Alumni webinar hosted by the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to connect virtually with fellow Hoyas for today's webinar, Franchise, the Hidden History of Civil Rights, Fast Food, and Health in America, with Marcia Chatelain. Marcia Chatelain is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. The author of Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, and Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, Chatelain is a scholar of African American life and culture. In 2014, she organized her fellow scholars in a social media response to the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri, entitled #Ferguson Syllabus, which led to similar online initiatives and has shaped curricular projects in K-12 and university settings. A frequent public speaker and educational consultant, Chatelain delivers lectures and workshops on inclusive teaching, social movements, and food justice. She has contributed to theatlantic.com, time.com, Ms. Magazine, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, which also named her a top influencer in higher education in 2016. She has won several teaching awards at Georgetown, where she has also served on its working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. During the 2017 to 2018 academic year, she was a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellow. She has been awarded an Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellow at the New America Foundation and was also named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow in 2019. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement in Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tips and reminders. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel within 48 hours of today's broadcast. You will also receive the link to the recording in a follow-up email. Marcia Chatelain will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Please send in your questions using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please also submit those concerns to me via the questions section of that control panel. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Marcia.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining me in an opportunity to talk about my new book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. I've been at Georgetown since the fall of 2011, and I've had an incredible opportunity with this book and my first book to visit the various alumni clubs across the country. I'd like to send a special shout out to clubs in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Chicago, and Houston for hosting me in the past. I'm bummed that engagements in Boston and Austin and St. Louis and Kansas City had to be rescheduled as a result of the shutdown. But when I am back on the road, I can't wait to see all of you at club activities as well as various events. Nothing is more gratifying to me than when I have a lecture or a book signing and I see a group of Hoyas in the audience. Occasionally there are Hoya parents who are instructed by their Hoya to go see my talk, and I've met some incredible people through this network, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. I'm also excited to talk about my book because in many ways this is also part of my experience at Georgetown. I've had so many undergraduate research assistants help me with this book. The author photo in the back of the book was actually taken by a Georgetown student who is a brilliant photographer, and a lot of the time that was spent working on this book was done on various fellowship opportunities available to faculty that was facilitated through Georgetown's support. And so as alumni who care about the university and who are sometimes wondering, what are the ways that I can support faculty and faculty classrooms? One of the best ways that you can support us is to support opportunities for us to further and continue our research. All right, on to the presentation. So my book, Franchise, is about how different forces converge in unlikely ways to shape the landscape of how we eat and how we think about health. So let me start with this guy. I don't know, this is a Hoya alumni event, so he might be on the call. But for those of you who do not know who this is Bill Clinton. He was once president of the United States. And for those of us old enough to remember what it was like when President Clinton ran for president, There were often scenes like this in which you could see him enjoying a stop at McDonald's, whether at the end of his jog or on the campaign trail. And you also might remember that this was sometimes lampooned on Saturday Night Live. I think a lot about President Clinton in relationship to a pretty famous quote that has since been taken out of context in reference to Bill Clinton as the first Black president. And if we go back into the archive to see who said it and why that person said it, it becomes really illuminating. So the idea of Bill Clinton as the first Black president comes from writer Toni Morrison, and she wrote in the New Yorker in the fall of 1998. After all, Clinton displays almost every trope of Blackness: single-parent household, born poor, working class, saxophone playing, McDonald's, and junk food loving boy from Arkansas. And what Morrison was talking about at the time was the Clinton impeachment trials, in which she suggested that Bill Clinton was being pursued by Congress in ways that were relentless and that it mirrored some of the discriminatory practices of the criminal justice system when it came to race. But one of the things I found very fascinating about this quote is her insertion of McDonald's as a way of understanding race. McDonald's is eaten by people all over the world and in a number of contexts, but I'm always really fascinated by the associations of fast food and African Americans in the context of conversations about health and disparities with access to healthcare as well as health outcomes. So in thinking about why Bill Clinton's consumption of fast food became one way of analyzing the way he is perceived racially as well as his socioeconomic background, it made me think about how fast food became a fixture in African American communities. And to understand that story, we have to go all the way to scenes like this. This is a scene from Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Now, if you, like me, were at attention during the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri, watching cable news, this McDonald's on Florissant Avenue in Ferguson, Missouri, was a focal point of a lot of the uprising because it was a place where both police and protesters could also always be found. In addition, reporters often used this McDonald's for the Wi-Fi, a place to take a break, and many of the various actors in the drama of Ferguson, Missouri found themselves at this McDonald's. This scene reminded me a lot of scenes like this from 1968, in which racial conflict and contention over police brutality and violence erupted in a major city area. And in this picture in 1968 in Washington, D.C., this was the uprising after Martin Luther King's assassination. So why are these two bookends in Franchise? Well, they tell a story of how people think about how we resolve racial tensions in America, not through restorative justice, but often through the marketplace and the expansion of business opportunities. After the uprisings in 1968, McDonald's Corporation realized that a number of their white franchise owners who operated McDonald's locations in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Washington, D.C., wanted out of those communities. They were concerned that if another uprising occurred, that they would be targets of violence and frustration from the surrounding community. So McDonald's decided that they would allow white franchisees to leave the city, go to the suburbs, and in their place, they would be replaced by African American business people who wanted an opportunity to franchise a McDonald's. So after this move in 1968, we have the seeds of what we see today, in which many inner city communities that are predominantly comprised of residents of color are also often the same communities that have the highest concentration of fast food outlets. So in order to appreciate this moment in history, we have to do a little bit of business history. So we live in a nation that's filled with franchises. In fact, about 250,000 fast food franchises exist in the United States, and close to 750,000 businesses in the United States are franchises. When we think about franchising, we often think about drive-throughs, but in fact, many of the businesses that we patronize or we are getting excited to patronize when things open up again are often using the franchise model. Now, to understand franchise, franchising, the best way to understand it is how I describe it in my book. Franchising is the same as if two parents run a household. They establish all the rules, but the children in the household earn all the money that the family needs. What do I mean by that? The parent corporation for every franchise sets the terms and the rules of how the business will be conducted. And after they are given their fees and their cut of the action, the franchisee is able to earn money. So franchising in many ways maps itself onto ideas about American opportunity, because at the heart of franchising is the ability to follow rules. You don't have to have an advanced degree or an MBA, and you don't have to have a lot of specific business knowledge. The promise of franchising is that if you stick to the playbook, you too can make your own fortune. And so the book captures the heart of franchising, as well as the ways that McDonald's became a quintessential American brand through the lens of race and civil rights in America. The first chapter of my book, Fast Food Civil Rights, tells the story of the founding of McDonald's in Southern California by Richard and Maurice McDonald through the perspective of the changing landscape of race in America at the time. These two men were given several chances after trying to make it big in Hollywood, trying to operate theaters, trying to operate a hot dog stand. They struck gold with the McDonald's concept. And I talk about the ways that the building of the highway system, which often happened at the expense of African American communities that were cleared out to build those same highways, facilitated the growth of fast food in America. I talk about the ways that the GI Bill, while also providing a lot of opportunities for returned soldiers after World War II to go to college and to open businesses, often excluded African American veterans. I talk about the suburbs that provided homes for many of the families that would later patronize McDonald's, the ways that those same suburbs were racially exclusionary. By taking a look at how race formed the building of this iconic brand, I help readers understand that these are not disparate stories, that a lot of the building of American businesses were predicated on the idea of discrimination and exclusion. I also talk about the ways that McDonald's was a target of many civil rights activism efforts in the South to desegregate McDonald's. When we think about the great desegregation battles of the 1960s, we often think of brands that are no longer with us. We think of Woolworths or Crest's Drugs or Katz's drugstore, but rarely do we see that McDonald's in places like Memphis, Tennessee, Greensboro, North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, as well as Pine Bluff, Arkansas, they were definite targets of groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to end segregation in their restaurants. Chapter 2 looks at this transition point after the assassination of Martin Luther King, when McDonald's made a concerted effort to recruit African American businessmen to open McDonald's outlets. So in cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., the deal was that you could leave your franchise if you were white and uncomfortable doing business there. And McDonald's went about a process of recruiting African Americans who are knowledgeable in some businesses, who are members of the community, who are well respected, to come in and reopen those stores. The reason why this was so important is that if you look throughout the 1960s in cities that experienced racially based civil unrest, many people were surveyed about how they felt about different social issues and how they contributed to these violent confrontations. And often people talked about police brutality. They talk about the lack of access to good housing. They talk about inequality in the educational system. And they often talk about the discriminatory practices of merchants in their communities and the deep desire to buy Black, basically to purchase goods and services from Black-owned businesses. And so part of that effort to buy Black and to create more Black-owned businesses in these communities was heavily supported by Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration under this umbrella term of Black capitalism. And it's this idea that the next stage in the civil rights movement would be for African Americans to have more economic ownership in their communities. And so under this umbrella of programs and ideas came moments like this. This is a plaque that still is outside of a McDonald's restaurant on the south side of Chicago for the Chicagoans in the seminar. And it says on December 21st, 1968, this location was franchised to the first McDonald's African-American owner-operator. It is not a coincidence that 8 months after Martin Luther King's assassination, there is this moment in which a McDonald's is finally owned by an African-American, and it's believed to be cause for celebration. Throughout my research on this topic, as I looked at the pages of African-American publications like the Chicago Defender, old magazines like Black Enterprise and Ebony and Jet, there were often photographs like this that heralded the first group of African-Americans who entered fast food franchising. And these people were considered incredibly impressive, not only because they were able to be part of this iconic brand, but because of the amount of philanthropy and community efforts that they were at the head of as McDonald's franchisees. A lot of these franchise owners became quite wealthy, and their wealth was able to fund not only local programs, but they became very critical in the funding for the United Negro College Fund and for the support of historically Black colleges and universities. Chapter 3 of the book looks at a moment in the history of McDonald's that involves Cleveland, Ohio. I did an event in Cleveland in February, and there were a number of Hoyas in the audience. And this pivots around a series of protests that happened in the city during the moment where the man pictured in this photograph, Carl Stokes, was seeking re-election. He was the first African-American to be elected mayor of a major metropolitan city. And while he's preparing for re-election, a battle breaks out over McDonald's. Cleveland is a really interesting vignette in this research because it pivoted around a series of boycotts that were initiated by a group called Operation Black Unity. This group of young men were part of a group that was under that umbrella group. And Operation Black Unity, unlike other protests of McDonald's in the 1960s, weren't challenging the right to be served at a McDonald's. They were challenging the right to own a McDonald's. McDonald's had been very profitable in Cleveland's predominantly East Side neighborhoods, and a series of boycotts were initiated to tell McDonald's that if they were going to continue to do business in Black neighborhoods, they insisted that the franchise owners were also African American. And in this chapter, I study Cleveland to really emphasize the ways that McDonald's became a symbol not only of a place to get a burger and fries, but about economic and political power in predominantly Black cities. The next chapter looks at another series of conflicts about McDonald's. While cities like Chicago and Cleveland were really supportive of this idea of African American franchising, in other cities, there were actual questions on whether McDonald's was good or bad for the larger community. So chapter 4, Bending the Golden Arches, looks at challenges to McDonald's in the 1970s. The photograph you see here is an FBI photograph that was taken outside of a McDonald's that was the target of a protest by the Black Panther Party for self-defense. The Black Panther Party had initiated a free breakfast program for children, and they expected the local McDonald's franchisee to contribute provisions to provide these breakfasts. When the manager refused, he claimed that the Black Panther Party actually bombed that McDonald's location. There's a lot of contention about the truth of this issue, and there's some questions whether there was some FBI interference to discredit the Black Panther Party, as had been the case throughout the country. But at the heart of the issue was the expectation of how McDonald's would operate in an African American community. I talked about the ways that these community groups put a lot of pressure on McDonald's locally to be a good citizen, because by the early 1970s, because of a lack of options in community to purchase prepared foods, because of the moving away of grocery stores, which would later become what we call the food deserts of inner city communities, many residents used McDonald's frequently to get meals. And there was a realization that the Black consumer market was making a lot of money for McDonald's. And the question is, what did McDonald's owe these communities? So the chapter looks at the Black Panther Party, pictured here, and their debates with McDonald's. I also focus on small conflicts involving neighborhood groups like the Ogons neighborhood in Philadelphia and their protest against McDonald's. I look at the practice that became very popular in the 1970s of African American celebrities creating their own alternatives to McDonald's to support the idea of buying Black. And so their argument was, if you really wanted to support the Black community, you shouldn't purchase McDonald's foods from a Black-owned McDonald's. What you really should do is go to places like Champ Burger, which was headed by Muhammad Ali. Yes, he used to have a burger brand. Or Mahalia Jackson, the famed gospel singer, she had a chain of fried chicken restaurants called Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken. And so you see all of these debates about what does it mean to authentically support African American communities with the dollar, and all of these confusions about whether Champ Burger or Mahalia Jackson's was really different than going to a McDonald's. In fact, James Brown gave a press conference in the winter of 1969 announcing that he would no longer do music so that he could focus on his chain of gold platter restaurants. Spoiler alert, it did not last very long. The next chapter looks at the cultural work of McDonald's. In many ways, fast food is sometimes characterized as wholly generic and uncreative, but what I found in researching franchise is that when I looked at the targeted marketing toward African American people and communities, I saw a lot of creativity and the opening of a number of doors for African American advertisers and musicians and artists. And I like to think about the ways the fast food industry creates feelings that have very little to do with the food and more to do about the experience. If you think about the fact that by 1974 in America, African Americans had only been federally protected to use public accommodations for a decade. And you see a major brand like McDonald's have ads like this: give our best to your family, we do it all for you. We start to understand why fast food became so appealing to a segment of the consumer base that had been so left out of the consumer citizenship that was critical to America at mid-century to the present. And so for many African Americans, even though these appeals might seem a little cheesy to us today, this type of advertising was very effective because it was one of the few times people saw themselves represented in the commercial space. And so I talk about Burrell Communications, one of the groundbreaking advertising firms that emerged in the late 1960s that did this type of marketing campaign for McDonald's, and how popular these ads were in Black publications, and how important the National Black McDonald's Operators Association was to making sure that this advertisement got to Black consumers. I also talk about the ways that African American franchise owners were so important in creating the Martin Luther King holiday as part of the corporate apparatus of McDonald's. For those of us young enough to remember the days of the adoption of the King holiday, it was a very controversial idea to devote a federal holiday to Dr. King because his reputation wasn't as we see it today. There was a lot of fighting about whether he was the right person to honor. There were counter proposals that in fact Frederick Douglass should have a federal holiday and not Martin Luther King. There were still people who were willing to say on the floor of Congress that he was a communist, that he didn't love America. And so with McDonald's having such a strong network of African American franchise owners, they paved the way for a lot of these large-scale MLK holidays that we see today that corporations contribute to. And so Black franchise owners paid for these videos where this image comes from that were played on local television so that people could celebrate Dr. King. They created radio programs and booklets for children so that they could understand the importance of Martin Luther King. Also central to McDonald's marketing to African Americans was their sponsorship of arts activities. Here, McDonald's is an important contributor to the gospel tour circuit that was very popular and continues to be very popular with African American consumers. For those of you who remember the 80s, McDonald's sponsored the American Double Dutch League, and they were featured in several McDonald's commercials. And we know how important the McDonald's All-American basketball game has been for young athletes. And I talk about in the pre-social media, pre-YouTube world, this is where a lot of African-American athletes got exposure to top recruits. So we see the ways, again, that McDonald's was able to graft a sensibility as being part of African-American communities in order to sell their product. Chapter 6 looks at an important turning point in the 1980s, in which McDonald's started to broker various deals with major civil rights organizations to expand the numbers of Black-owned franchises in African-American communities. One of the reasons we see the type of hypersaturation that concerns many people is because there were these high-profile boycotts or threats of boycotts of McDonald's on the part of folks like Jesse Jackson, who's pictured in this frame. And if you look closely behind him, Al Sharpton is right behind him. Organizations like Operation Push, which was led by Jackson, or the National Action Network that was headed by Al Sharpton, would get in the middle of these disputes, whether it was on behalf of Black franchise owners who felt like they were being treated with bias in the McDonald's system, or people who felt like they were excluded from opportunities of franchising. They would broker deals about the expansion of restaurants that were under the category of minority owned. This becomes really important because we start to see that over the period of the 80s and 90s, we just see more and more fast food outlets. And these practices weren't just being done by McDonald's, they were being done by other fast food brands. So I talk about a case involving an African-American franchise owner in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles chapter of the NAACP, and the various ways that McDonald's saw itself as securing equal opportunity for access to wealth through the franchise system. But even as more and more people were able to enter franchising, the wages and conditions for workers weren't changing. And finally, the book ends with kind of where I started in terms of the relationship between race and tensions in cities and the fast food industry. So this picture is from the 1992 Los Angeles Uprising. And I found this really fascinating press release that McDonald's shared with the nation after things calmed down in Los Angeles. After the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the 4 police officers who were responsible for that beating, Los Angeles went up in flames. There was a lot of frustration and a lot of despair about the nature of race and economics and community harmony during that time. And at the end of the uprising, McDonald's released a statement saying that none of its restaurants in South Los Angeles were harmed in the uprising. And they saw that as vindication for their efforts after 1968 to bring more African Americans into franchising. And I thought that statement was a little bizarre and incredibly strange, the ways that they were tying civil unrest to McDonald's and reifying the idea that if McDonald's is able to be present in Black communities, it reduces it as a target of anger. So I went deep into the archive to try to see if this claim was actually true, and I had a hard time either verifying it or disputing it. But what I realized, though, is that claim was believed to be credible because McDonald's had been such a fixture in African American communities for so long, and that at the end of the day, when we talk about health, and we talk about obesity, and we talk about hypertension, and we talk about diabetes in America, we often talk about the individual nutritional choices that people are making for themselves and their families. And rarely do we really reflect on how choices are constructed in a larger system of federal subsidies that get people into franchising, the ways that communities depend on individual franchise owners to support their endeavors, and the ways that communities feel connected to brands not necessarily because of the products themselves, but because of the ways that they feel included into something they've long been excluded from. And so in all of these complicated ways that McDonald's has existed in Black America, I wrote this book for people who want to do something about the health crisis in America, but have not looked to history as a guide to understand that even if we give individuals all of the information that they could possibly use about why kale is better for you than French fries, about the importance of nutritious meals, that if we are not concerned about the real lived experiences of people under poverty, if we don't understand the importance of people discovering the MLK holiday inside of McDonald's instead of a school, then we lose sight of the complex ways that fast food exists in people's lives outside of a drive-through. And so I leave you with a few thoughts about how you have thought about fast food, about the ways that fast food is represented in the larger narrative of health in America. When we talk about workers and we talk about wages, what is important to understand about how the fast food ecosystem has developed in the United States, the ways that it imagines itself as an extension of the civil rights struggle, and the ways that the reality of fast food labor and the fast food industry are in opposition to it. And so I hope that in our time together we get some good questions, but I think the thing that I hope the most for people who are very much concerned about these complex issues is that we understand what a useful and important tool history is, that as we deal with the consequences of the coronavirus, that we think about the importance of not only thinking of this as a challenge to the private sector, but boosting our public resources so no one's left behind, but how the assumptions that we make about the choices people elect in their personal lives, how much those are a product of complicated stories that hopefully we take a time to listen to and learn more about. And with that, I turn it over to Kelly to moderate the questions. Thanks, folks.
Marcia, thank you so much. This is so fascinating and enlightening for those of us who hadn't yet, really been aware of this complicated history. So if anyone has questions, please do submit them via the question section of the GoToWebinar control panel. So there are a few already that have come in. We'll start with this one. Were McDonald's franchises actively closed to Black would-be owners before 1968?
This is a great question. So prior to 1968, there had been some talks of perhaps opening up the opportunity to franchising to African American business people. But the events of 1968 really kind of hastened that move. And so McDonald's immediately, when the unrest was starting, dispatched a man named Roland Jones from Washington, D.C. He was managing McDonald's throughout the city, and he was at the one at New York Ave that's still here today. He gets in his car and drives to Chicago to try to recruit the first Black franchise owner. So it was the immediacy of 1968 that hastened the process, though there were some talks about it earlier. The other thing that's important to know about this story is that the reason why that first dozen or so African American men became franchise owners is because part of the Nixon administration's outreach, and as much as Nixon was into outreaching to African Americans, part of that happened through his creation of the Office of Minority Business Enterprise and making the Small Business Administration loan program for minority-owned business. Franchises could apply for that. And so McDonald's also had the support of this SBA bureaucracy to get more people into that system.
Okay, another question. You focus quite a bit on McDonald's specifically. Did other fast food brands, Burger King, KFC, Arby's, etc., follow the same route as McDonald's for Black franchisees?
So McDonald's kind of set the standard. And when we think about fast food, there are brands that are older than McDonald's, like White Castle, Dairy Queen and McDonald's are about the same age, but McDonald's kind of changed the game. And so when McDonald's was showing success with their African American recruitment, Burger King and KFC were pretty close after. And then you see some efforts on the part of like Taco Bell, but McDonald's kind of was the gold standard, not only in the recruitment of franchisees, but also in the marketing initiatives. And so other brands followed suit, but McDonald's was leaps and bounds kind of ahead of them. The other thing that's important to note about McDonald's, if you saw the movie The Founder with Michael Keaton about the early days of McDonald's, that there's a moment where I think BJ Novak plays his advisor, where he advises him to buy real estate. And that was a very shrewd decision on the part of McDonald's. McDonald's owns the real estate on which its franchises are built. And this becomes really important because it has been able to secure a lot of wealth for McDonald's. And, business people sometimes make a joke that McDonald's is a real estate company that offers burgers. This is really important in the 1970s. As a result of the recessions and the oil embargo, fewer people in the suburbs were going to use precious oil to drive to go to a McDonald's with their families. But in a lot of these inner city locations where people walked to locations or didn't have cars, they were finding that McDonald's was still profitable. And that helped fuel their desire to go into the inner city. But the other thing that's important to note is that after a lot of these communities suffered property damage after uprisings, the cost of their land also decreased. So McDonald's was able to expand in communities where the cost of land was decreasing and people were not disturbed in their consumer behaviors by the oil embargo. And so this was very, very important for McDonald's to survive throughout the early 1970s.
Okay, the next question. Franchising is a difficult business model for many franchise owners to make money on today. Small margins. Has there ever been an organizing effort among Black business owners to change the business dynamics with corporate ownership?
Ooh, that's such a good question. This is why I love Hoya crowds. The questions are always so layered and sophisticated. Yes, franchising is a rough business. I think it's so interesting that you raise that because even when in the early days of African Americans franchising, even when their businesses were profitable, they often talked about having to organize the National Black McDonald's Operators Association because they were still left behind. So a location in Chicago could be making hundreds of thousands of dollars more than the average store, but because of discriminatory practices in terms of access to capital that the franchise owner could lean on in case something happens, African Americans had less access to that. If you think about insurance rates in certain parts of cities are higher than others. If you think about the cost of security, those were higher, and that was part of the conflict in Los Angeles that I write about with a man named Charles Griffiths. And so African American franchise owners were saying, we out-earn our white counterparts, but our businesses are more expensive to run. And the reason why they were making a case to do the targeted advertising is every franchise owner has to contribute to a general advertising fund. And they were contributing, but they're saying, you're not advertising on Black radio, you're not in the Black publications, and so you're not actually using our dollars to get to that very targeted market that we serve. So in terms of people coming together to try to fight these practices, the National Black McDonald's Operators Association has been very active in lobbying McDonald's corporate for more opportunities to expand restaurants, for more opportunities to bring in African American suppliers and other vendors. In December of 2019, Business Insider had a 3 or 4 part series about the fact that the number of African American franchise owners of McDonald's has been declining over the past 2 decades because of these same challenges: a lack of access to capital, the inability to expand past 2 or 3 franchises, and then with the modernization of a lot of fast food outlets, the touch screens, the introduction of all-day breakfast, 24-hour drive-throughs, refills, all of these different practices, the incorporation of the McCafe, so you kind of feel like you're at Starbucks, but you're at McDonald's. All of those things cost a lot of money, and the franchisee has to absorb those costs. Franchising a McDonald's, the financial requirements to enter that are pretty high. So you have to have a lot of cash on hand, a lot of liquidity. But for some of the smaller franchises that have a lower barrier of entry, those are the ones where you see families working around the clock to try to keep them open and really, really struggling.
Fascinating. We're getting so many questions and also notes of thanks to you for doing this. I echo those thanks. So this next question, thinking in particular of the Black Panther Party's interactions with McDonald's that you cite in your research, how did you see the Black communities and or individual consumers reconciling the corporate structure and interests of the company with the identification of local franchisees? Did you see people making that distinction?
That is such a wonderful point. The one thing I want to point to, the cover of the book is actually the Portland McDonald's that was the center of this conflict. So eventually, the Black Panthers and this McDonald's locations made up, they made donations, and then it became a site of a voter registration drive. And I also want to alert you to, before I forget, this beautiful photograph taken by a Georgetown student who's class of 2021. I just want to acknowledge that. So this is like the heart of the issue about what does it mean to buy from a Black-owned business. And this issue comes up when the NAACP initiates what they call a selective buying campaign or selective boycott campaign in Los Angeles in the 1980s. NAACP is boycotting McDonald's because McDonald's franchise owners are saying, the African American ones are saying, we can't expand outside of African American communities. We are being redlined. So they're using a lot of the language of real estate discrimination, redlining being the practice of African Americans not being extended loans so they can buy homes in other non-African American communities. So they say we're being redlined out of locations that are outside of Black neighborhoods. They make this claim, and McDonald's says, no, we just think if you know how to do business in your community, this is civil rights. And they say, no, it's not civil rights. So there's this big back and forth. And so the NAACP takes out an ad in the Los Angeles Sentinel, and they tell Black consumers, they say, look, we want you to boycott McDonald's, but not the Black-owned ones. And you'll know which ones are the Black-owned ones because those are the ones who are in all Black neighborhoods, and that's why we're protesting. And you're like, what is going on here? It becomes so complicated. And I think what happens in those cases is that because African American franchise owners tend to own fewer stores in their portfolio, tend to be such an important fixture in the community. They're the person who are giving out the local scholarships. They're the ones who are on local Black radio encouraging people to fill out the census or to register to vote. They are the people who are appearing on weekend programs that are targeted towards African American consumers, that people in those neighborhoods know who that person is. And so even if they have a critique of McDonald's, they may not have a critique of that particular person because of the role that that person is playing in their community. But this becomes a little bit of a problem when there are labor disputes between workers and Black franchise owners. And there have been anecdotes about Black franchise owners trying to appeal to racial solidarity to try to get workers to not organize a union or make some attempt towards challenging those practices, because that owner very much can say, I'm getting squeezed by McDonald's also. There's racial discrimination even among this higher echelon of someone who's under McDonald's. And so you start to see these really complicated ideas about racial solidarity as well as intra-racial conflict when you look at the relationships that are tested by this system of franchising, which is very high stakes and which is really stressful. And so African Americans who might say McDonald's is a horrible corporate organization, or who may even have a critique of capitalism, may have a very good relationship with a McDonald's franchise owner. I tell the story about Ralph Abernathy, who was the successor of Martin Luther King at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference In 1969, he travels all over the country as a tribute to Martin Luther King's life at the 1-year anniversary of his death. And he gives a speech where he says, we don't need Black capitalism, we need Black socialism. And that's a very strong critique. And then he goes to McDonald's a couple weeks later and he picks up a donation from an African American franchise owner. And so one of the things I wanted to do with the book is to talk about just how complicated consumer and market relationships can be when you think about it in terms of race and belonging and discrimination.
Wow, like so fascinating, so interesting. Again, so many more questions than we really have time for. All this being said, I think we do have time for one more question, and we have a couple that are asking, what exactly do you see as a way forward for the low income, the vulnerable minorities who are in terms of accessing healthier food options, and how can we use this history to change, to find change?
So the first thing I think is so important, especially now. I mean, the coronavirus has opened up something that can either be good or more destructive. It has opened up, I think, a serious moment of reflection about inequality in the world. And as Hoyas, you have been part of that conversation, since your first days at Georgetown. Someone has talked to you about the problem of inequality. And it is now being exposed to so many more people as we see how vulnerable some communities are to the virus and how other communities have options to distance themselves from it. But at the end of the day, why did McDonald's, why were they able to kind of saturate African American communities the way that they were? Well, it was because there was a community in crisis that had been cut off from the promises and the protections of the state, and they were very vulnerable. And what flooded in was a cheap source of food, low-wage jobs, as well as support for cultural, educational, and athletic enterprises. And so part of why I wanted to write this book is I wanted to understand how, at a moment in which African Americans are most hopeful that their civil rights would be respected, that they were most kind of alienated from the promises of the nation. And who was there to fill the gap? McDonald's. And it kind of worked. And so when we make arguments about why people should make different choices, we have to acknowledge the meaningful nature of the choice that they're actually making. That McDonald's is meaningful, even if it's uncomfortable or problematic, if McDonald's has done more than just delivered a hamburger to you. If McDonald's was the place that employed people who had a felony conviction record and were denied work at other places, then McDonald's means something to you. If McDonald's facilitated the possibility of someone in your family going to college because they worked there and it was a better option than the student loan system, then McDonald's will mean something to you. So all of this is to say, we are at a moment right now where there are parts of our civil society that can be eviscerated by this crisis, whether it's the US Postal Service, whether it is the public school systems that may not be able to survive after this crisis, that we are in a moment in which we will see the worst aspects of disaster capitalism exploiting and hurting the vulnerable. And what we really need to do is think about the histories and moments of disruption in which corporations tell people, we've got better solutions, or we don't need the government, or we don't need civil society, we'll answer these things, and say, wait a second, no, let's think about other ways of doing this. Let's think about how to make sure that we don't have so many vulnerable people in 100 years when the next pandemic comes. And so as a historian, all I can offer is the possibility that we believe in a society in which we take care of each other. People ask me like what my feeling is about fast food is. It's delicious. I understand why people eat it. I understand why I ate it so much as a kid. It's so good. I don't have a problem with a company selling someone French fries or milkshake. That is fine. But that company should not set the tone of how much people make, or whether a person can go to a doctor or not, whether the person can take a sick day, whether a person can take a day off during a pandemic. whether or not that person can be at work and be focused because they're not sure if their kids are in a safe school. I don't want those two forces to be so intertwined that people feel like there's no hope or there's no space for us as individuals to take care of each other. We have a robust system that's available called taxes to provide people with the things they need. And McDonald's has a mechanism to deliver food as it sees fit. But once those roles get intertwined or they get confused, we find ourselves feeling powerless. And so I think the way forward is to take history seriously, to be more compassionate with ourselves and with others, and to be more critical of systems that suggest that they have answers and they haven't asked us first.
This was incredibly fascinating and insightful, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Hoyas, as always.
So I wish you could see all the comments that we're getting that of thanks, and some club. I think the club at Atlanta requested your presence as soon as we're able to.
I can't wait to travel again. Atlanta is such an important part of this story. If you want to continue this conversation on my Twitter at Dr. M. Chatelain, we can continue chatting because I'm not going anywhere.
Great, I really appreciate that, and I'm sure that our guests will too. Did you have any closing remarks before we wrap up?
Just the incredible gratitude that I have towards this community and their desire to keep learning. You know, you teach students for a year, 4 years tops, and then they move on. And there's nothing more amazing than, again, the deep desire to continue engaging. The number of times students visit campus say, Professor Chatelain, can we talk? No one at work talks. I want to talk about something. I just really love this community, and I love the ways that you animate the values in everything you do. And so there's no way I could have completed this book and been able to really have a successful foundation at which to talk about it without the incredible love and support of the many Hoyas that I've taught. So I just want to say thank you right back.
Oh, thank you so much. And we're now getting flooded with thanks to you too, even more. But so thank you again for taking the time to present to our community today, Marcia, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed this discussion and will join upcoming webinars. Please look out for our follow-up email, which will include more information on upcoming events, as well as a link to Dr. Chatelain's book, a feedback survey, and a link to today's recording. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Bye.